Hey there, Vermont, America. Um, I have to thank a fellow female Vermonter for sending me a link to take a look at the brains behind AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I'm going to share a list of names here before I dive in. Hey there, Bob. How are you? Basically, this video that she shared with me, and after taking the time to actually listen through the presentation by a Jordan Peterson, I think it's going to be kind of interesting to discuss how a cast of Bernie Sanders 2016 campaigners were recruited by some very interesting or an interesting team of wizards behind the scene, pushing an Ottoman Empire approach by one gentleman, and I'll get his name out there in a second. As well, he's inspired by the 1911 Turkish Revolution that was responsible for killing 1.5 million in an Armenian genocide. The Ottoman government approach that he's discussing is more of a constitutional monarchy or an absolute monarchy. Then we've got Shavkat Chakrabarti, who is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez chief of staff presently. Was her campaign manager. Might be in a little bit of trouble with some of the financing aspects of everything, because he also is the co-founder, along with Walid Shahid, communications director for Justice Democrats. I'm just going to read a little bit now. The two co-founders of the Justice Democrats, I'm just going to read a little bit of this. Is social justice, racial justice, economic justice, and then just justice. I'm going to share the video with some clips so you can kind of see some of the faces, the names that are tied into this organization. Shavkat Chakrabarti is inspired by, and I haven't heard this name in quite some time, and I must admit I had to sit and really dive into the Ottoman Empire, some history throughout the Indian period of, and here comes the name, Subhas Chandra Bose, who is got a very interesting quote, and I'm going to just share this quote. Our philosophy should be a synthesis between Nazism and communism. Subhas Chandra Bose, violent opposition to Gandhi in India, was an Indian nationalist whose defiant patriotism made him a hero in India, but whose attempt during World War II to rid India of British rule with the help of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan left a troubled legacy. And as we go through this, it's a very interesting video. And so I put a post up on the Green Mountain Republicans Facebook, as well as my other groups, in order to actually, because everybody had these questions, who's the wizards behind Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and 6 other U.S. Congress members that are just basically, they're getting a little bit of trouble with some serious anti-Semitism, anti-Israel anti-Jewish comments. And as we dive into this, hey there, Bob. As we dive into this and we start sharing some of the history, it's really interesting because this social justice, or this what's the group again? Democrat Justice. They were the co-founders of or Justice Democrats. Socialist, social justice, racial justice, economic justice. And we're going to go into the video just a little bit, just to kind of do some snippets here. So I'm going to flip this around. So here's the post that I put up there, and I actually took most of the morning to gather the data and put some information links in order to tie in the philosophy, the history. And let's just go to the video real quick.
The brains behind Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
And there's
Mr. Reagan.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is not really the Congresswoman of New York's 14th Congressional District. She is essentially an actress. She's merely playing the part of a New York Congresswoman. I know this sounds crazy, but bear with me. In 2017, a group called the Justice Democrats held auditions for potential congressional candidates that they would run on their platform for various congressional seats throughout the country. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's brother Gabriel submitted her for the role. Now, I've auditioned for many acting roles in my day. I've also cast many of my own projects. I know how this works. If you find somebody with star power, even if they don't 100% fit the part, you go with it. Obviously, AOC has star power. Just look at her. She's a superstar, the most famous person in Congress, maybe ever. Their casting was perfect. Now, I didn't have to go digging for evidence for this, because they freely admit it. They brag about it.
Back in 2016, we put out a call for nominations. We got over 10,000 nominations. Out of those 10,000 nominations, we found Alexandria.
My brother told me that he had sent my nomination in the summer, but I was like literally working out of a restaurant then. I was like, there's no way.
A casting call. They had a casting call. They cast Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the role of Congresswoman. And they did this so they could promote their own agenda. In this video, I'm going to make 3 very serious accusations against Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. 1, she did not actually run for Congress. 2, she is a puppet congresswoman. And 3, the people controlling her are very dangerous. The first point I have already made. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did not run. She was run. What I mean by that is Alexandria did not take it upon herself to run for Congress. She was used by this group, the Justice Democrats, as a figurehead through which they could gain control of New York's 14th Congressional District House seat. These guys not only scripted and produced AOC's beautiful campaign video, but they organized the entire grassroots campaign effort. They handled all the fundraising, the social media, the get out the vote effort. They turned Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez into a brand, and they used that brand to take control of that House seat. The people of New York did not elect a Puerto Rican girl from Brooklyn to represent them. They elected an Indian guy from Texas and a white guy from Tennessee. Now, let's move on to my second accusation. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a puppet congresswoman. AOC does not make her own policy decisions. She does not decide which way she votes on legislation. She defers completely to her team. This is a serious claim, I know, but consider the following evidence. This is a video of Corbin Trent, one of Alexandria's top advisors, speaking with Zach Alexi, the Saul Alinsky-style strategy expert who organized much of AOC's campaign. Corbin Trent is now Alexandria's top congressional aide.
And what's the stat that we were looking at earlier about
how much people are making?
Yeah, about low-income people and how big of a percent of our society that is now.
40%. Well, people that make $19,999 a year or less. So people that make $20,000 a year or less make up right around 40% of Americans, right? So it's
40% of Americans make less than 20,000.
Yeah. It's like 60 million people make less than $20,000 a year.
200 million Americans make less
So-
than $20,000 a year.
It went from
That's
60 million to
40% of this
200
country.
million.
40% of Americans make
Nearly-
less than 20,000.
That's 40% of this country.
These guys are coaching her. They're scripting everything she says. You notice when she goes off script because she suddenly starts babbling incomprehensibly. The girl in this next clip is now the head.
Okay, I just stopped it for a quick moment because I wanted to discuss that. So, you heard the two gentlemen talking about 40 million Americans making in that bracket, and then she inflates from 40 million to 200 million Americans. If they're coaching her, someone's certainly raising the numbers quite a bit. That's a major difference of 160 million people. But let's go back to the video real quick because it's actually pretty, it gets even better and a lot more interesting. So stay tuned and bear with me.
Of the Justice Democrats. Her name, Alexandra Rojas.
Really, I think a big anchor piece is the Green New Deal and talking about it in a frame of social, racial, and economic justice and a mobilization of our economy and our society at the scale of what we did during World War II.
The Green New Deal, how's that going to be different?
I think what we're calling for is a mobilization of our economy, of our society on the scale that we haven't seen since World War II.
Like, this is the war. This is our World War II.
It's clear that AOC is being coached on absolutely every policy point she makes. And if this is not enough to give you pause, consider that the Green New Deal was drafted in one weekend by her staff.
Okay, so in one weekend they were able to type out a 12-page document of the Green New Deal, roughly a $93 trillion, 100% renewable energy makeover, tying in with the Medicare for All that she cherry-picked or borrowed from Vermont's third-term U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders. Basically a $125.6 trillion in two programs. And I want to just flip over because this is going to get so much better because it dives into some of this, the extreme progressives. There's a leader that's coming up that I didn't name prior, but we're going to show his face as well as some of the financing that is producing some of these groups. So let me flip this script. Flip the, here we go. Continue. There's Psycat.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had zero to do with it. As far as I could find, she wasn't even in the room. Now, this is AOC's landmark legislation proposal. It essentially sums up her entire platform and lays out everything she wants to do in Congress. She didn't even participate in the drafting of the legislation. And again, these people aren't even trying to cover this up. They're proud of it. Again, AOC is a figurehead, a mouthpiece. The congressional seat is being operated behind the scenes. Old interviews show that the Justice Democrats initially declared that they wanted candidates of substance. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was a bartender. Now, who is more useful to an evil organization trying to take over Congress? A principled politician who happens to align with their views, or a pawn? A malleable innocent who they can manipulate, somebody completely ignorant of politics who must rely wholly on them to direct all her political positions, statements, and votes. AOC has had enough embarrassing gaffes to know that if she goes off script, it hurts. It can humiliate her.
I want to comment on that alone. We do know that she has some gaffes out there, pretty serious as a matter of fact. And the numbers that are being calculated for those two programs, as well as the unsustainability of these 100% renewable energy resources. They didn't do much research diving in, but we're going to flip over and please stay tuned, and here we go.
So she has become absolutely dependent on the instruction of her handlers. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez seems like, to anyone unfamiliar with her arrangement, like a bit of an enigma. Most of the time she seems to bumble along with no apparent idea about what she's doing. But sometimes she says and does things that seem kind of brilliant.
Let's play a lightning round game. I'm going to be the bad guy, which I'm sure half the room would agree with anyway. And I want to get away with as much bad things as possible, ideally to enrich myself and advance my interest, even if that means putting my interests ahead of the American people. The limits that are placed on me as a congresswoman, compared to the executive branch and compared to, say, the President of the United States, would you say that Congress has the same sort of standard of accountability?
In terms of laws that apply to the president, yeah, there's just almost no laws at all that apply to the president.
So I'm being held, and every person in this body is being held to a higher ethical standard than the President of the United States.
That's right, because there are some ethics committee rules that apply to you.
And it's already super legal, as we've seen, for me to be a pretty bad guy. So it's even easier for the President of the United States to be one, I would assume.
That's right.
Thank you very much.
This is initially what got me thinking. Who's pulling the strings here? Who's the man behind the curtain? I went to CPAC last week, as some of you know, in Washington, D.C., and I met a lot of people in politics. Occasionally, somebody would bring up AOC. I always took this opportunity to ask one question. Who's really running the show? Who's the brains behind Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? One guy had an answer. He grabbed his phone, he pulled up a Politico article, and he shoved it into my hand. That's who, he said. The man behind the curtain is this guy.
There's Shakat Chakrabarti. And the individual that is on his t-shirt is Subhas Chandra Bose. And I'm just pausing it quickly because this is going to tie into a interesting tree of former Bernie Sanders communication directors in the 2016 election cycle. And it's going to tie in the overall agenda of the 7 elected officials that they actually achieved in specific districts into the U.S. Congress that we're, hearing a lot of anti-Semitic as well as anti-American related issues. And let's go back to this introduction.
Saikat Chakrabarti. Saikat was AOC's campaign manager and is now her chief of staff. Saikat came out of Harvard and worked as an organizer for the Bernie Sanders campaign. This guy doesn't really have the charisma to run for office himself. He's a little awkward. He might have Asperger's or something like that. He kind of reminds me of Daniel Radcliffe, actually. But don't let his disarming awkwardness fool you. He's been an extremely effective political operative. He's got some terrifying political influences, and he's suspected of committing some severe campaign finance violations. But we'll get into all that later. Saikat Chakrabarti is a sinister character, and hearing more about him later will give you chills. But the man who hired him to head up the Justice Democrats will horrify you, if you can even believe it. The mastermind behind it all, Cenk Uygur of the...
Cenk Uygur. Now that was the individual that I purposely left out of the intro. And I just want to give you a little bit of history. Founder of the Young Turks. He's inspired by the Ottoman Empire, the 1911 Turkish revolutionaries that basically went on a 1.5 million Armenian genocide. And I'm going to flip back over to this gentleman here, because when you hear him speak of their goals and their agenda to take over the Democratic Party, you're going to understand why Nancy Pelosi is, and several of the older, let's say, old guard established Democrats are seriously freaked out about, because And I'm going to let you hear it out of his mouth first. Here we go. There's his name. There's his face. Here we go.
The Young Turks. Now, this may all sound completely nuts, like a big conspiracy theory, but the Justice Democrats was heavily promoted on the Young Turks. We have video evidence from the inception through into the campaigns.
I think they have maxed out on incompetence. So that is why we must choose a new path. And that is what we embark upon today. What we need to do is take over the Democratic Party.
A hostile takeover of the Democratic Party, and it gets much better as you learn more of his. I don't know how much of individuals still remember Joseph Stalin, the Bolshevik Revolution, how he was more of a quiet thug that ended up taking over, as we all know. And the Stalin dictatorship of the USSR, the United Socialist States of Russia, or we're going to get, I don't want to get tied in or confused too much of that, but I just want you to listen to this gentleman speak. And as the host was stating, very aggressive, talking about young, strong, aggressive, progressive socialists, Democrat socialists, and it gets better. It's going to flip over.
And as Martin Luther King said when he did the Civil Rights Movement, he said he was doing it not just to help African Americans, but to save the soul of America. Here we're going to try to save the soul of the Democratic Party by boarding the Democratic Party ship and taking it over. How are we going to do that? We're going to run strong progressives. From now on, there will be a new wing of the Democratic Party, and it will be the Justice Democrats. We will seek social justice, economic justice, racial justice, and plain old justice.
Now, you might think, if Cenk wanted influence in government, why didn't he just run? If Saikat Chakrabarti wanted influence in government, I mean, despite his awkwardness, why didn't he run? Why put up AOC? The goals of this group are far grander and far more sinister than simply electing a single congresswoman to office. The goals are to take over the Democratic Party, eventually take control of Congress, and in turn, control the United States. And I know all of this sounds completely insane, but they have expressed their intentions very clearly on camera.
We're going to run hundreds of candidates, and we're going to primary all of the establishment Democrats. So we're not going to be like, is it Chuck Schumer? Maybe yes, maybe no, right? No, it's a hard no. But wait a minute now. Are you really going to primary vulnerable Democrats? Yeah, that's the whole point. If in 2018 we don't achieve our grand vision of a wholesale change in 2 years, which is very, very hard, we know that, right? Are you kidding me? If you got 6, let alone 12, let alone 24 people in Congress, you know what would happen in Washington? People would freak the hell out.
And we're actually seeing that right now because they did get 7. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and 6 other U.S. Congress men and women, and I'm going to allow him to do the introduction of each one, and you're going to kind of realize some of the dragging their feet, some of the chaos, some of the anti-Semitic, blatantly anti-Semitic comments, as well as some of the other, as much as he's claiming racial justice, and as much as he's praising Martin Luther King and wanting to save the soul of America, wait until you see how they decide to twist it and actually turn America into a socialist model. Basically, what Bernie Sanders is bragging about right now, that all his seriously radical ideas are being picked up by several of the potential 40-plus candidates that are getting ready to run in the 2019-2020 election cycle. Let's go back to listening to him for a second.
Good. Oh my God, what in the world? These guys that had no money to begin with, no nothing to begin with, just put 24 people in Congress. Look, we want hundreds. We want to replace Congress.
In an article in Politico, one journalist wrote, "The group's criteria for picking primary targets is unclear and at times contradictory." Yeah, that's because their goal is not ideological. Their goal is control and power.
Washington doesn't care about beseeching. That's not how it works. They care about power. So primaries are an exercise in power. It's way past time that progressives exercise their power in this country. And that's exactly what these guys are doing.
Waleed Shahid, communications director for the Justice Democrats, has said you can tacitly support Medicare for All and the Green New Deal.
Okay, and I did mention this young gentleman earlier. Well, Waleed Shahid, communication director for Justice Democrats. He was specifically recruited from the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign. And we're going to tie in some very big donors. And of course, you're actually going to hear George Soros a little later in this presentation. Some other key players and political organizers across the country that worked for Bernie Sanders that are now recruited into the Young Turks, the Justice Democrats, pushing the socialist justice, the racial justice, the economic justice pitch, and then, as you heard him say, the justice, just plain old justice, which we're basically learning that a lot of it is you are guilty right off the bat. And I want to tie that into that whole Ottoman Empire and how justice is dealt with. Basically, you're guilty until proven innocent versus innocent until proven guilty with due process. This is something that you should really pay attention to because it gets much scarier as we start to discover some of the individuals that inspired these gentlemen in each one of their ideologies and how they've pulled some of that out and they're tying it right into this new 2019-2020 election cycle. They've achieved their goal. They got 7 representatives in the House. And let's go back to some of these key players.
And we still might primary you because there's enough energy in the district to find somebody more charismatic and compelling who is actually going to be a movement builder. No, you know why they might primary you? Because they don't own you. And maybe they found somebody that they think can beat you and that they can control, another AOC. Even Ilhan Omar has said it's quite inappropriate for groups to decide on whether or not somebody deserves to represent their district. Those decisions need to come from the people that we represent. And Ilhan Omar was actually endorsed by the Justice Democrats after she won her primary. The reason more people aren't speaking out against this completely unethical political tactic is that nobody knows it's happening. I mean, you might be asking, if all these guys are so corrupt, if what they're doing is so obviously sinister, why hasn't anybody else reported on it? Their tactics have been extremely different to anything seen in the US before, and that's probably why nobody has copped on to what they're doing yet. Also, mostly what they're...
Now, I just want to disagree with this young man just for a second, because we actually have heard how Bernie Sanders has said it in past videos. You have to learn how to manipulate the American media. Like some of his past heroes, Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro, Castro, and he has come right out and said that. You have to learn how to manipulate the American media. We've seen how he's manipulated the Vermont media. We're also seeing how in Vermont's House, Vermont Senate, Lieutenant Governor seat, we have a supermajority of Democrat socialist, progressive socialists, or socialist progressives, however they want to say it, trying to rebrand and respin some of these past socialist, communist, Marxist ideals into a completely new brand And when you see kind of the comparisons, and you're going to start to understand why, when we have these public hearings in Vermont, there just seems to be certain individuals that always get to speak. And as long as it aligns with their agenda, their political agenda, you're going to see how that manipulation and actually having, taking those small money donations, buying up the airtime, being able to isolate, or basically any independent candidates or up-and-coming candidates are having a hard time beating any Democrat socialist or socialist progressive presently here in the state of Vermont, one of the only Democrat socialist supermajorities in the country. So let's go back.
What they're doing is annoying Democrats, so conservatives haven't paid all that much attention. The first thing the Justice Democrats did was to try to primary Democratic incumbents. What that means is they would mount primary campaigns against incumbent Democrats, establishment Democrats already in Congress that they didn't like. This, as far as I can tell, was Cenk Uyghur's idea. Basically, the concept was, since many establishment Democrats weren't progressive enough, i.e. socialist, the Justice Democrats would nominate their own candidates to mount a primary challenge. One of the guys they didn't like was Joe Crowley, the guy.
Now, Joe Crowley was the established Democrat in Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's very dominant New York district. You're going to see how they are strategically taking, let's just say, vulnerable established Democrats that are either kind of still stuck back in the 20th century. Not the best, not the most productive. I mean, even Bernie Sanders is trying to take all the credit for this right now. And yes, he might have inspired some of the Young Turks, this Justice Democrats, which have some very extreme radical views, very socialist, as well as some interesting bullying tactics, manipulation, and let's continue.
That they put AOC up against. He had been in Congress for 20 years. Other members of Congress have reached out to AOC to try to convince her to stop primarying establishment candidates, but they're reaching out to the wrong person. AOC does not control the show. They should be trying to convince Saikat Chakrabarti. He's the one AOC takes her orders from. But Cenk and Saikat's plan is not to win a couple of congressional seats. It's total congressional domination.
Look, we want hundreds. We want to replace Congress.
Basically, Cenk's plan in creating the Justice Democrats was to replace all the Democrats in Congress with his own people. Radical leftists, socialists, people who would fall in line with his ideology. And he did it. He actually did it. Now, Cenk comes up with a clever quip from time to time, and he's been able to create a very successful propaganda platform with the Young Turks. But if you've ever watched him, you know he's not exactly a genius. He talks and acts more like a two-bit thug than a political pundit.
Which is actually a repeat of history from the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union that I was just referring to. Joseph Stalin was more of that quiet thug that Jordan Peterson is mentioning here. And this new movement in 2019 and how they are going into key Democrat districts, trying to knock off some of the, well, what we would want as far as individuals that have been there for like 44 plus years, like Senator Leahy. Sanders has been there 30 plus years, and I realize he's got a fan base, but he hasn't been very productive. And Welch. Now, all three of these Democrats, it's a very Democrat, socialist, progressive socialist state, but every single one of them have been involved with serious scandals or taxpayer bailout Ponzi schemes like the EB5 scandal that really gave a negative $65 million result in that failed real estate boondoggle, let's say, by two long-term donating developers, okay? The Burlington College debacle was Jane Sanders' own, let's say, miscue of failed real estate speculation. And as you're seeing other colleges are failing, getting ready to close down, and you're going to start to understand why this stuff is happening here in the state of Vermont, because it is just bad policy after bad policy, a rigged tax code setting people up for failure. We're at a number 50 GDP. We're a number 50 at education funding, which is rock bottom worst. The only spot that we're doing really, really well in is we are the number 50 smallest carbon footprint state, and yet we're listening to this 100% renewable energy only without discussing the new innovations with small modular reactors and some of the fast reactors that have been realized in other states like California, Texas, in order to maintain. Vermont is already way, way small on the carbon footprint, okay? And this climate change apocalypse now that they're trying to fearmonger our kids into, if you dive into that even further, you'll start to understand the whole game plan of how they want to pull out $500 million per year of taxpayer hard-earned money on all the fossil fuels. They want to ban natural gas, and it gets better. So I'm going to flip into this.
So how did he do it? He hired geniuses. He brought in the top guys from the Bernie campaign. The Bernie campaign was unprecedented in their grassroots success. They were brilliant. I actually did a lot of research on this, and the keys to their success are equal parts nefarious and creepy, but they are, nevertheless, very effective. And you got to hand it to Cenk. Bringing these guys on was a brilliant move. Fresh from the Bernie campaign with nothing to do, they must have been itching to tackle.
Now, Cenk, I'm going to give him credit, but as he was stated earlier, is more of a bully, let's just say. And as much credit as he's giving Bernie Sanders' former staffers, having worked with several software engineers at Fidelity Investments down in Boston from India, and let's face it, there's really good and bad. Now, I wouldn't necessarily call these gentlemen geniuses. They were able to jump on a kind of an already made brand that Bernie Sanders has, been beating that drum for 30 plus years in the state of Vermont. He made a backdoor deal with Hillary R. Clinton back in 2016, knowing the fact that, let's just say, some of that Russian collusion money, some of the Clinton era of corruption foundation, she had all of her bases covered. She had a former president, she had the Department of Justice, she had the FBI completely bleached bit, and several of them bribed, basically, and was able to pull off something that, even to this day, people are confounded on. I mean, she broke just about every ethical, legal, exposing SAP national security that anybody that was actually in the field would probably be, behind bars right now. But it's because she was able to raise all that Russian collusion money, all those gifts as Secretary of State, to become a multi-million-dollar foundation. It's corrupted the FBI, the Department of Justice is in shambles, and there is a complete mess that needs to be cleaned up. But let's dive back into the video here, because Jordan Peterson is bringing out some really good stuff, and we're going to start tying a lot of this stuff together.
A new left-wing political project. So Cenk had this crazy idea. Replace all the Democrats in Congress with his own hand-picked radical left socialists. And he had a brilliant idea. Get the geniuses from the Bernie campaign to do it for him. And they did it. They succeeded. Perhaps not as well as they wanted, but it did work. And that is terrifying. Of the guys that Cenk brought in from the Bernie campaign, the two most important, from what I could find, were Saikat Chakrabarti and Zach Exley. Sykot seems to be the philosophical core of the operation, and Zach Exley is the organizational mastermind. Zach Exley is basically an expert on Saul Alinsky-style community organizing, and both he and Sykot are tech guys. They're very experienced with social media campaigning. Now, they did a great job in 2018, but make no mistake, these guys are not content with their 2018 victory. They're playing a long game here. 2018 was just the beginning. They'll redouble their efforts in 2020, 2022, 2024, at which time I am 100% convinced that they will run somebody for president. For the 2018 elections, the Justice Democrats endorsed 79 candidates. 26 of them won their primary elections. 7 of them won in the general election and are now in Congress. Most of these people's names I can't even pronounce. Raul Grijalva, Ro Khanna, Ayan Presley, Pramila Jayapal, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Okay, I'm just pausing it for a quick second. So there's the 7, and we already realize that 2 of them have blatantly gotten into a lot of trouble with some very anti-Semitic comments, as well as sitting on a very powerful committee as freshmen in the U.S. Congress. It should be a little bit scary for anybody that's ever served in the U.S. military, for anybody that's ever gathered intelligence, for anybody who is, put their life on the line to protect this country. We've got our children being indoctrinated by this climate change apocalypse. It is something that we have been addressing now for several, years, several decades actually, but they're using a fear-mongering tactic to still use our children against their parents who've actually helped or either worked or done research within these fields, designing some of the new technology that's supposed to power us into the 21st century, but pitching another taxpayer bailout Ponzi scheme in order to pull out $500 million a year and fund 200 miles of industrial wind turbines, destroying massive amounts of Vermont environment in the mountain range, 30,000 acres of solar farms with no recycling. These are all heavy metal solar panels, once covered with snow, not as efficient, and without some kind of nuclear stability. It's just, we got to be able to bring Vermont back to profitability. Right now, it's in a financial crisis, downsizing mode. Colleges are closing. There's a $1.6 billion debt in the teachers' pension. There's an overall $4.6 billion debt from that jumping on the boondoggle of universal and single health care experiment. And you're going to be able to start tying more of this in here shortly, because this is definitely I think we do need to send more kids, like either right off in the military and let them serve in China, let them serve near North Korea, let them serve as a humanitarian effort right now in Venezuela, because they're going to actually be able to witness how these dictators deny the people the food, how they redistribute it and sell it while their people are starving. They're manipulating their own currency, and our kids are being indoctrinated from K through high school and even into college that socialism is better than our capitalist model, our innovative entrepreneurial spirit, the research. It gets better. We're going to flip this.
Of these 7, 3 were chosen through the audition process and are, as far as I can tell, puppets of the Justice Democrats, Sykot Chakrabarti, and Cenk Uygur. These candidates are Ayan Presley, Rashida Tlaib, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Imagine if they run not 79 candidates, but 200 or 400 or 1,000. At their current rate of success, they would get 88 House seats, and if they improve...
Now, I'm flipping this back over just because we've got about 40 plus presidential hopefuls, okay? We've got roughly, a dozen? We've got 2 that are in exploratory committees, and we have like Joe Biden sitting on the sidelines waiting to possibly toss his hat in. Bernie Sanders is presently in the lead through name recognition, as he's trying to, claim everybody's cherry picking my platform, where it's going to get so much better here in a few minutes, and a lot of things are going to start falling into place, and you're going to start to understand why Vermont is sitting dead last in GDP, while it's sitting dead last in Vermont education funding, because there's the tax code is rigged for failure here in the state of Vermont. We've got 96% of Vermont businesses that are roughly small business owners trying to just squeak out a living, let alone any kind of a profit margin, so that way they can actually hire on more and hopefully design new leading edge products that they can sell in the future, employing Vermonters here. But people are getting so frustrated because it's a never-ending taxation, and we're going to see why here shortly.
Prove their techniques, they might get more, including Senate seats. The first screenplay I ever wrote, I was 15, it was about a future in which a megalomaniac was trying to take over the U.S. government. He was trying to do this by installing puppet politicians throughout the U.S. Congress, giving him a majority, and in the climactic point in the movie, his puppet president is also elected. So in my screenplay, this villain effectively gains control over the U.S. government through these politicians who are loyal to him. I never thought that this fiction that I wrote as a teenager would ever become reality. It's completely crazy, but it looks like this has actually started to happen. Cenk Uygur is no longer formally associated with the Justice Democrats or AOC's congressional team, but whether or not he still holds influence over these people is unknown. What is known is that these people are dangerous. Zach Exley is a radical left Open Borders guy who was once a fellow at the Open Borders Foundation, which is George Soros' organization, and he seems to be the least extreme of these guys. Cenk Uygur calls his organization the Young Turks. The Young Turks is named after a group of Turkish revolutionaries formed in 1911 who slaughtered 1.5 million people in the Armenian genocide. So we know where Cenk's influence is at. Saikat Chakrabarti is influenced by this guy, Subhas Chandra Bose. How do we know this? Because he wears this Che Guevara.
That's the... You're going to really... And I'm just going to read you Subhas Chandra Bose's philosophy. Our philosophy should be a synthesis between Nazism and communism. You're also going to hear it right from here.
Style shirt with Subhas Chandra Bose's face on it in most of his videos. That seems like a pretty deliberate choice. At first, I actually thought it was his own face. I was like, why is this guy wearing a shirt with his own face on it? That's crazy narcissistic. But then I figured out it was this Subhas guy. So who is Subhas Chandra Bose? He was the violent complement to the non-violent Mahatma Gandhi. Yes, the legendary Gandhi. Whilst Gandhi was trying to expel the British from India non-violently, this guy was like, no, let's start a war and let's kill them all. Actually, it was worse than that. Much, much, much worse. Subhas called himself a socialist, but he is quoted as saying, our philosophy should be a synthesis between Nazism and communism. Another important thing that we need to recognize about Subhas is that he was an anti-colonialist. Now, we're not super familiar with this political perspective here in the US, but in India, anti-colonialism causes deep resentment to this day. This is explained in the documentary film 2016, Obama's America. In this film, Dinesh D'Souza explains anti-colonialism and shows how these ideas influence Barack Obama, because...
And we also know what happened to that poor young man at first. They basically trumped up some charges, threw him in jail. Now he's finally been released. And some of this is... this is going to just continue getting a little scary, because the tactics that are being used is you are guilty as charged without due process. Now, back under the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton and several other individuals she had the Department of Justice covered with, she had FBI agents that were, no one was able to get away with as much as Hillary Clinton of just utter pay-for-play access, corruption, and to this day confounds anybody that's ever served in some of these capacities or had maintained SAP security, or it just, it's awe-inspiring as some of this stuff kind of plugs in, and you're going to start seeing the motives and how some of this stuff on the present situation going forward with the 40-plus candidates announcing. And let's get back to this.
And this is the scary part. The United States is founded on colonialism. To the anti-colonialist, the U.S. is an evil empire that colonized North America. The United States is the enemy and is to be fought, is to be resisted, torn down. This is the guy that Saikat Chakrabarti, AOC's chief of staff, wears on his t-shirt, a pro-violence, anti-colonial socialist who dreamed of a Nazi communist government. This is the man behind the curtain. This is the brains behind AOC. It's definitely scarier to me that he's not a congressman, but that he is the man behind the curtain. There is no accountability for the man behind the curtain. If AOC falls from grace, he can just hire another actress. There are no term limits to being the guy behind the curtain. When I got back from CPAC 6 days ago, Saikat Chakrabarti was in the news for the first time ever. I was surprised because I'd never heard of him until I went to Washington. As it turns out, he has been flagged recently for diverting at least $1 million in campaign donations from the political action committee that he was running to shell companies that he set up. At the moment, it's unclear whether he was embezzling the money or just hiding it from FEC oversight. Either way, it looks like he's in trouble. For a guy who claims to be trying to get money and influence out of government, he doesn't seem to mind leveraging those tools himself. You may have heard something about this. What you probably haven't heard about is AOC's sinister living wage rules. So AOC announced a little while ago that she was going to cap her congressional staff's pay at $80,000 so that she could pay her bottom level staff a living wage and her interns $15 per hour. But here's the thing. AOC's living wage rule allows her staff to dodge financial disclosure laws. Under federal law, congressional employees who earn over $126,000 per year must disclose all of the outside money that they earn. Because AOC's top staff will not be making over $126,000 per year, they will not be subject to this law. I wonder who came up with this brilliant scheme, Saikat Chakrabarti. I know it wasn't the bartender. This team of guys who got AOC elected and who are now pulling the strings of her congressional seat declared at the outset that they were trying to bring integrity.
Okay, now I just have to tie this in. Many of these individuals worked in the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign. And we all have been wondering how Bernie Sanders has been able to consistently raise $8 to $9 million going across the country, being a part-time U.S. Senator for the state of Vermont, and not really getting anything done whatsoever, period. Missing 37 out of 38 votes during the 2018 election cycle. And the key is being able to manipulate the Vermont media, which we all know he's a master of. He can rarely ever answer a direct question. We had asked for 3 debates, at least as a minimum, one in the spring, one in the summer, and one in the fall of the 2018 election cycle, in order to give the up-and-coming candidates at least an opportunity for Vermonters to hear their platform. Because in specific media sources, they would ask direct questions about whether you supported the border wall, what you wanted to do for vetting process for individuals coming into the country, how you wanted to adjust the tax code. Every single one of those was put into like a 7-minute snippet, missing the vast majority of the interview on VPR. Or we would, and listen, I'm not putting down these media resources because they at least gave us an opportunity to be interviewed, but it was just interesting how only certain questions would be aired in order to either align you a certain way without ever diving deep into your platform. And especially when you've actually designed leading edge software that has generated over 200 plus billion in under a year for much of that older generation to help subsidize their retirement. And then we're dealing with a state that is consistently failing because of a tax code that is rigged against hardworking Vermonters. As much as Bernie Sanders goes around beating up the top 1%, he's among that group now. He has 3 homes. He's a multimillionaire. Now, granted, he's not quite in the billionaire class, but for a guy that's really not gotten much done, he's done a lot better than the vast majority of Vermonters that live in the state of Vermont. And as much as he claims that he's the champion for the middle class and the poor, that's exactly what these taxes for the fossil fuels, in order to fund the 200 miles of Green Mountain Ridgeline, the 30,000 acres of solar farms, are going to be taxed to the brink of complete failure, or they're going to finally wake up, leave the state of Vermont, as we're seeing a lot of individuals are. Now that we do have an older tier that are retiring, they're going off into their retirement, and they're leaving this huge mess for whoever is willing to clean it up. But yet there's a rigged process in the Vermont House, the Vermont Senate, the Department of Taxes. As much as you want to offer, good solutions in order to bring down the tax code so Vermonters the affordability here in Vermont can be easier and raise Vermont's GDP from number 50 dead last, at least up into we're probably never going to fully make the mid-20s, but as a small state with roughly our population, and unless it became more business friendly with access to low interest capital, or at least Vermonters trusting other Vermonters to try to grow a business model here in the state of Vermont, it would become, 1, a lot more successful, 2, the debt would start to be erased, and 3, we would still remain in the lowest tier of carbon footprint states because we've actually applied a common sense solution with some of the newer, smaller footprint reactors that are so much more efficient, can provide a stable electric grid without raising carbon taxes to the point where you're taxing people out of the state of Vermont. Virtually without, individuals to come. And then I just want to chime this in there. That whole $10,000 ploy to lure, so-called talent back to the state of Vermont. There's plenty of talent here that's seeking funding, but because we're native Vermonters, they're not interested. They won't give you that break or access to this funding. So anyways, they're going to lure in other individuals so that way they, right off the bat with this $10,000, as soon as they come in the state, they're already at a $5,000 tax burden debt. And then, I'm just saying, if they were to collect that right off the bat, then they only have $5,000 to basically get set up for just 1 month. That's not a good financial picture. And as much as people are listen, I love Vermont. It's just some of the policies are just mind-boggling. They're set up to fail, and we're starting to see why, because there's certain individuals that probably should be term limited out of the Vermont House, the Vermont Senate, and in these seats, and especially on our federal level, U.S. Congress and the Senate. But let's go back.
Into government, transparency, to flush out the corruption. Well, it looks like they're trying in every way they possibly can to hide their own activities. They say that sunlight is the best disinfectant. I say it's about time we pulled the curtain all the way back on this particular wizard and all of his friends. Oh, and just remember, the next time you see Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she's fake. She's a fraud. She's not real. None of her tweets are actually her tweets. None of her speeches are her speeches. Her answers to questions and interviews, she was coached to give those. She's not a real congresswoman. She's an actress. All right, that's it for me. If you like this episode, hit the like button.
Okay, so that's that. Now, I was going to go into this other Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez video, but let's face it, she's getting enough attention as it is. She's an attractive young lady. There's 6 other U.S. Congress members in the House that are all pitching this very serious agenda, and the more you dive into it, please just go to the link on the Green Mountain Republicans. I'm going to also post all this information on this video in that comment area. Just learn a little bit about the Ottoman Empire, each one of these individuals, and the scary future that they're talking about, because it's just, well, like Bernie Sanders says, he wants to take credit for all these radical ideas that everybody else is trying to adopt. And it's basically because they've got a bunch of young kids that are actually, yeah, they're drinking it. There's polls saying that the prior generation, what is it, the millennials, I'm part of the X generation, feel that socialism is a better idea than capitalism, and yet none of them have ever lived in a failing state like Venezuela, or were off the coast of Vladivostok, Russia, when the Soviet Union collapsed in '91. To them, it's not completely understood until they actually feel the pain when you don't have access to food, toilet paper, let alone some of the long bread lines that we saw consistently in the Soviet Union just before it collapsed, that they're actually seeing down in Venezuela. But right presently, until they get Nicolas Maduro out of the picture and his little military beneficiaries, let's say, or the dictatorship, it's a never-ending. Whenever Americans send off in humanitarian efforts in some of these countries, unless we send in individuals that actually distribute the food, that actually make sure that people get the food, it always turns into a small period of time where the dictator is actually finding a way to profit off of selling the food and basically forgetting his people. So, anyway, I hope that was a little more informative. There's some links on the Green Mountain Republicans History of Vermont Politics on Facebook. I am going to be giving, hopefully, some makeovers on the websites and start getting geared up for what sounds to be a very exciting 2019-2020 election cycle. And we've got about 40 clones that are pitching this kind of Democrat socialist progressive, or progressive socialist model. One, it's not that progressive. Two, not very democratic, because it's a never-ending, consistent restriction of your rights, your constitutional rights, and we are definitely seeing that right here, right now in the state of Vermont with some of the bills in the Vermont House and the Vermont Senate. So with that, I'm going to close out that in VTC there's a public hearing, Judd Hall, on the 12th, covering many of the changes in the fish and wildlife, hunting, fishing, and the firearm bills. And then on March 23rd, 2019, at the State House, the No Carbon Tax Vermont group is piecing together a presentation about some of the stuff that I've discussed here a little bit on pitching this 100% renewable and this $500 million a year tax scheme on fossil fuels while trying to ban certain energy industries, when they know already other states have failed with the 100% renewable. They had to build the new small modular reactors in order to make it a more stable grid, bring it back to profitability, and those smaller modular reactors are actually able to plug into, or actually renewables are able to plug into the grid with them. And this constant never-ending fear-mongering about nuclear energy and nuclear weapons with this whole new F-35 debate two different. One's an energy source. One is a completely different technology, and it's something that many Vermonters have got to start leaving that 60s, 70s fear mongering and those old stereotypes back in the past, because many of us in this generation have achieved some pretty big things with every walk of life, either in the military or have friends across every demographic. And Vermont is dealing with a very serious affordability crisis. This tax code does need to be addressed, and Vermonters do need to get involved. You can't have less than 5% vote on some of these local budgets, and you've got to stop electing some of these seriously far left. It's their way or the highway, because Vermont will never come back to profitability until you address that tax code and you start to become more business friendly. And I'm really tired of the stereotype that if you are into business, you're anti-environment, and that's just not true. There's several of the renewable energies that are just fledgling. They're still in the development phase. It's just not sustainable right now as a 100% renewable energy source, and especially taxing the heck out of the fossil fuel industries, or these dirty fuels, or however they want to rebrand them. It's just financially unsustainable, and it's only hurting more Vermonters. So hopefully that was informative, and I don't know, stay engaged, and please get out there and vote. Go to some of these hearings and really start to ask some great questions. Have a great evening.